Number 10. The Sliding Timescale. Today's top 10 is a simple and pretty widely requested one after I made the same sort of video for the DC universe. It's time for literally the same thing but with Marvel, and because of that we're diving right into things with my 10th favorite aspect of Marvel canon, the way events are kept in that canon. Over in DC, their content exists in eras, punctuated by partial or even full-fledged reboots that often lead to major shifts in the story in order to accommodate changes as the timeline gets too cluttered and the times and standards of a particular era in history move on from one to the next. Marvel, on the other hand, pretty much exists on a sliding timescale. Most of the events of their comics are still at least in some form of canon, just adjusted by the timeline as the real world moves farther and farther into the future. So Spider-Man did experience the death of Gwen Stacy pretty much as it happened in the original comic, but only several years ago instead of the few decades that story was originally published for. The Punisher is a veteran, but the identity of what war he was deployed in changes depending on when the story in question was published. The only exception to this is characters with a long lifespan like Wolverine, or characters with specific ties to certain time periods, such as Captain America or Magneto. It likely doesn't seem like a big deal on the surface, rather a small piece of trivia associated with DC and Marvel, but I actually think it's a really interesting aspect of Marvel's canon. While there are pros and cons to both DC and Marvel's approach to these things, the best part about Marvel is it allows the writers to freely call upon classic comic book history without having to worry about whether or not it's in canon, since it pretty much all is. It leads to many iconic character moments throughout Marvel's history, and it makes the worlds feel fleshed out, lived in, and nicely detailed. By preserving it, we get a lot of positive aspects out of their canon.
The magician once friends with Hulk, but now Hulk
I
smash!
imagine you're still upset about us shooting you into space.
Number 9. Time travel. Oh, time travel. Time travel is useful if sometimes questionable as a trope in science fiction. By no means is it unique to Marvel, and thus not all that special to Marvel in particular, at least not when compared to other franchises. What is unique to Marvel are the cool characters informed entirely by time travel, like Cable, Kang the Conqueror, or Captain America, as well as entire stories that rely on the trope, like Days of Future Past or Age of Apocalypse. It's all great and an awesome, endless potential of content. My favorite example of time travel in action might be in the Marvel miniseries from the mid-2000s featuring Cable raising a young mutant named Hope from birth as they travel farther and farther into the future to avoid danger. But it's far from the only example of the kind of amazing content you can get out of Marvel through the use of time travel. My ambivalence about the plot device aside, it is easily one of the most important and interesting features in Marvel canon. Number 8. Magic and technology. With this top 10, I'm going to have to generalize to cover everything, and this is a pretty solid example of that. While I'd be tempted to cover the Infinity Gauntlet as its own thing, it would probably mean leaving the Iron Man suits out. I'd love to specifically mention the Cosmic Cube, but it would mean not giving a spot to the Macleod Crystal or Spider-Man's awesome webbing. Marvel is so big and so full of awesome ideas that I really have to paint with a broad stroke when talking about all the concepts I like about the fictional universe, so there's going to be a great deal of this generalizing throughout the list, and that's pretty much in its greatest form here. Magic is pretty standard in any comic book or superhero universe, but Marvel is full of unique settings and ideas that draw from it that are very fun. Between the entire canon surrounding Ghost Rider, Thor, and Iron Fist alone, to the entire worlds of demons, magical realms, and characters that exist on top of that, magic is a critically fun part of Marvel canon. There are even clever little additions to this lately I love, that have resulted from the frequent use of magic in Marvel's world, including S.H.I.E.L.D. investing in agents along the lines of necromancers and putting them in their ranks. I like stuff along those lines because it shows this world has adapted to magic being a major part of it. The use of technology is also a great part of canon too, not only as a fun source of powers for a whole roster of heroes and villains, but also a critical part of a consistent tone Marvel has taken throughout its existence that embraces the role of science and technology in human safety, well-being, and development. It's an essential and core part of Marvel's philosophy and origins. Anyone who doesn't get that doesn't understand Marvel. It gets into the root of staple characters like Iron Man, the Fantastic Four, and Spider-Man, while also being a fun source of content such as the Danger Room, Spider-Man's aforementioned web shooters, and of course the helicarriers. The world of Marvel is full of wonderful creations along these lines, and both magic and technology enhances everything about that.
Good evening, Peter.
Hello? Hello?
Congratulations on completing the rigorous training wheels protocol and gaining access to your suit's full capabilities.
Thank you.
Number 7. Marvel's Earth. An earlier version of this top 10 featured 3 specific locations in the world of Marvel I thought were too cool to pass up on. They were Latveria and all the awesomeness associated with Doctor Doom, Wakanda for reasons that should by now be increasingly self-evident, and New York City for reasons too numerous to count. Then I thought of the Savage Land, and Kunlun, and Westchester, and it became quite clear to me I had to merge all of these into one topic to cover everything great about the Marvel version of Earth. There's so many great features of this comic book world that to leave any corner of it out would be unfair. New York City alone is full of these great real-world landmarks where all these memorable comic book events have occurred. I love how different boroughs are home to different heroes, and the use of a real-world city gives the lives of these heroes a certain traction, a grounded nature that gives everything they do a slight sense of reality, no matter how nonsensical their story might be. I love the detailed use of different countries, many of which have quite the history and lore behind them by now, even these fictional countries. It's just perfect, the ultimate playground for comic book writers to place an essentially unlimited number of stories within. The list of cool locations goes on, far beyond what I've just mentioned here. Adelan's, Sword and Shield's various bases and helicarriers connect this version of Earth to a bigger universe and give it a real sense of depth and history. The sheer amount of stuff in Marvel's Earth give it a strong feeling of being a whole and complete planet, larger than any one character or team, and never really revolving around any one person or group because of it. The geography of Marvel's Earth is amazing and a lot of fun, and the fact that it's only number 7 on this top 10 is a testament to how cool some of the other things we're about to touch on really are.
Tell me something. What do you know about Wakanda?
Number 6. The Cosmic Order. Next up is something I think is, in my eyes, an essential part of Marvel canon. The Cosmic Order refers to the surprisingly detailed hierarchy behind the ultimate beings of power that more or less control and rule over the Marvel Universe. The specifics of it all aren't worth getting into here, but it basically goes from all powerful beings like the Beyonder, the Living Tribunal, and the mysterious One Above All, to beings like Infinity and Death that specifically rule over the Prime Universe, down in towards Galactus, the Phoenix Force, and into other characters such as Odin and extremely powerful beings such as the Celestials. They're all quite interesting and part of a fun sense of canon and order to the Marvel Universe. I think the writers should largely get the benefit of the doubt when it comes to the exact specifics of this hierarchy, because any good fictional universe should have a little bit of flexibility to it. But it is important to have this sense of a hierarchy and order to these larger-than-life characters. And in doing so, they can really throw their weight around in terms of power. Thus, characters like the Living Tribunal have a real sense of presence and leave one hell of an impression given how powerful they really are. When you see characters like these involved, they instantly raise the stakes simply because of their presence. While they inform the likes of Thanos, make the Molecular Man a surprisingly interesting villain, and lead to countless cool stories and awesome settings like the Settlement of Nowhere, which exists entirely in the head of a dead Celestial. Content like that, which creatively shows off just how immense and powerful these beings are, that part of their corpse can be used for an entire civilization, gives these characters a real sense of power and ability. Then we get to characters like Galactus or the Phoenix Force, which give no end to cool stories and interesting takes on the world of Marvel and these larger-than-life beings. Marvel just wouldn't be the same without these characters and ideas, and the value of that cannot be understated.
I sent you here to draw out the one Earthling I deem worthy of being my new herald, the Hulk.
Number 5. An evolutionary inevitability. This one might seem a little weird since it's kind of an abstract and only vaguely referenced concept compared to some of the more tangible content in Marvel Comics. But it's one of the most important and interesting ideas that seems to persist in the canon. It's a nice explanation for the way superheroes only start to appear slowly in the various forms of media they appear in, and are always depicted as a more recent progression in the human history of Marvel's worlds. As these media expand, the presence of these superheroes ramp up more and more. We start to get more people with powers on the side of good and evil, new teams form, new characters appear, far beyond what is ever implied to have existed in the history of Marvel's world. As fans of old must have openly wondered why that was, what changed that people were suddenly getting these powers on a level that can't be compared to the rest of Marvel's history, something had to explain what was going on here beyond the usual notions of technological development. After all, many heroes and villains don't get their powers and abilities through technology alone. Over time, something, be it the work of Celestials or a more mysterious, unexplained purpose unique to the human race, it's been hinted that humanity seems to be on a sort of evolutionary trajectory towards everyone getting superpowers and eventually becoming heroes and leaders across the galaxy. The human race in the world of Marvel seems destined for greater things, assuming they can survive long enough to make that happen. It was directly explored near the end of the initial Marvel 2099 run, and as recently affirmed as during the Generations event that kicked off Marvel Legacy. It's a neat idea that nicely explains a facet of Marvel's history and production, gives the comics a certain sense that more is always coming to the future, and builds things up towards an exciting and more interesting events as we go along, even if those events aren't specifically ever planned out. I appreciate that optimism and think it nicely represents the overall tone of the brand on the whole. The idea that there's more behind the Marvel Universe and the rising tide of superhumans depicted throughout it is a really interesting one to me, and has been explored in a lot of very cool stories. I think it has a lot of potential behind it, and it's already led to some pretty interesting ideas, and here's to the many more we can look forward to. Number 4. Civic responsibility. Next up is a vital part of Marvel's philosophy that is expressed across many superheroes. We as a people have largely taken on a certain sense of responsibility out for one another. Oh sure, there's always going to be people who insist otherwise, but by and large, we, the human race, look out for friends and family, and often when tragedy strikes a neighbor, the community around it is usually the first and foremost source of assistance. Across the board, this example of a human spirit and civic responsibility exists in most countries where something hasn't gone terribly wrong. And Marvel, since pretty much day one, has always been about this kind of, civic responsibility is the word, but there's another word for it. It's on the tip of my tongue. Oh yes, social justice. Yes, that's it. These guys are all a bunch of social justice warriors. Scoff all you want, but I don't know what you think this character is all about, but if you know Spider-Man, Captain America, or literally any other Marvel superhero, you should know it's pretty much all about this responsibility these characters feel they have to do the right thing. It's admirable and a core part of what makes Marvel so great. This is what makes them heroes. This is what makes us root for Spider-Man and all the others, but in particular Spider-Man, this is what he's all about. You hear the with great power becomes great responsibility, but it has less to do with the responsibility of a superhero and more of this civic responsibility. That's what Stan Lee and every other Spider-Man writer should be getting at. I suppose I kind of left this out of the DC top 10 concepts because I didn't really think about it, But it is worth saying that Marvel in many ways kind of represents this notion of civic responsibility best. DC represents the American dream and those ideals and values behind it, and they do it quite nicely. But I think it's Marvel that kind of is best at showing the responsibility we, not superheroes, but we, readers, have to the world around us. To fight for what we believe in, to treat others as we would treat ourselves, and to engage in the community around us for the benefit of everyone. And like the characters depicted in Marvel, it really doesn't matter what tragedy we endure, what injustices we have faced, what may hold us back. None of that matters. There is no excuse. We all have this responsibility to look out for one another. The world could have treated you like dirt. I'm sure many people there have horrible stories of terrible things happen to them. I have my own share. And many characters in Marvel have been given the raw end of a deal. Yet a common theme among the best of them is that the ones worth following don't let life being unfair stop them from being a decent person. And there's very little more Marvel than that.
Look, when you can do the things that I can, but you don't, and then the bad things happen, they happen because of you.
Number 3. The Mutants. I love the X-Men. I love everything about them. Everything about the mutant race is great, and it seems like so many of my favorite superheroes and villains happen to be a part of or are directly related to the mutant race. Listing off examples would be foolish because we'd be here for 10 days. All the locations spanning the world, the hundreds of characters, the cool allies like Danger or the Shi'ar. They're all examples of vivid and creative content that adds so much to the Marvel canon all on its own. Along with hundreds of excellent stories, a bunch of cool video games, and a series of movies, some of which were profoundly influential in making modern comic book films a thing. Let alone whatever Logan is. That's like one of the best movies ever. The mutant race, this growing tide of empowered humans apparently at odds with their evolutionary non-powered peers, not only provides cool ties to the whole evolutionary thing I was talking about earlier, but also forms the backbone of a strong, if obvious, analogy about modern issues of discrimination in the real world. Marvel wouldn't be nearly as strong a brand as it was were it not for the mutant race, and it's all but certain they will find their way into the MCU. Given the nature and profound depth of these mutants, I couldn't be happier about this. Concerns about Disney's growing mountain of intellectual property aside, I'm just excited for my X-Men. I'm only human. Number 2. Endless Worlds. Alternate universes are a fun way to explore content in fiction. While they can easily be as trope-filled as time travel, they are a core part of what makes both Marvel and DC great fiction. While DC, I would argue, has done a few more interesting things than Marvel in terms of multiverse content, let's be real, there are plenty of examples of Marvel absolutely nailing this type of material. Between Spider-Verse, Secret Wars, and Uncanny X-Force, there are plenty of examples of wonderful stories in the modern age that show some really cool and interesting alternate worlds, fully embracing this idea of a multiverse full of never-ending variations on the Marvel canon, and paying off on that idea magnificently. Meanwhile, classic What If comics, The Exiles, and Mutant X are all solid examples of Marvel's long-existing roots in the multiverse. And so much of this content is a lot of fun and totally worth your time. Meanwhile, the Prime Universe itself is full of awesome planets and locations within space. The 9 Realms are a great source of cool stories, and there are infinite number of magical dimensions and realms out there too. The number of worlds that exist within Marvel canon is literally endless, and there's no limit to the possibilities these sort of stories offer because of that. Much like DC, it is one of my all-time favorite aspects of Marvel canon. But unlike DC, there is one concept I think is a more important one to Marvel, and in my opinion, the most important aspect of this particular franchise.
Oh, must have hit my head pretty hard, because you look like Peter Parker.
You know my secret identity? Oh,
Number 1. Counterculture. In my view, the best thing about Marvel Comics, that goes all the way back to the boon of the Stan Lee era featuring the likes of Fantastic Four, Spider-Man, the X-Men, and all the other mountain of major characters introduced around that time period, is this notion of counterculture. Through varying degrees of subtlety, Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko, and a team of other awesome writers and artists carved out the Marvel Universe with a distinct and consistent theme underlying every title, that of pushing against the culture of its time. This refers to the revolution of the 60s that pushed against the social norms of that era, opening the world to more accepting attitudes when it came to race, women, while gradually others, including those of non-traditional sexuality, would find their acceptance decades later. Since its earliest days of being called Marvel Comics, this company has largely embraced these values in principle, if not always in practice. The most obvious and perhaps best example of this has to be through the X-Men, which since their beginnings have had a pretty clear representation of the struggle during the Civil Rights era in the form of standard superhero content, but with a strong, clear, obvious, and plainly stated political message behind it. Though the X-Men are a great example of this, and a very obvious one, I think this counterculture notion was best expressed through the character of Spider-Man. This hero has long been an example of pushing against cultural norms, working against authority figures and the wealthy in the name of the greater good, rejecting traditions of the past, and instead empowering oneself with ingenuity, technology, and civic engagement. Most Marvel characters have pretty much represented counterculture in various forms because of this. The Hulk is a strong expression of anti-nuclear sentiments, while even weird characters like Thor pretty consistently are seen as outsiders in their own homes, with Odinson often in conflict with his more traditional and close-minded father. Even billionaire Tony Stark has always been shown as a different sort of a wealthy person, one that doesn't conform to traditional standards of what we might expect out of a rich person. That's kind of the whole point of his character, after all. Captain America, ever since he was thawed out, has always been confronting problems in American society head-on, with his partner the Falcon, and the counterculture that those comics get into are as plain as the eye can see. Even now, in the modern age, when Marvel is one of the biggest film studios on the planet, it still somehow feels like they are working against the curve rather than part of it, with each new blockbuster challenging what people expect out of the company itself, and often working miles ahead of other major film studios that are trying to copy Marvel's success as a cinematic universe. Whether or not that particular example at the end qualifies as counterculture is out for debate, since at this point, Marvel kind of is the culture. But regardless, it is a core tradition of Marvel Comics that, through various titles, still continue to this day. I will say now more than ever it seems like Marvel is chasing after the culture rather than trying to lead the change within it. But they do good work at maintaining their characters as these outsiders, most of whom are willing to question and defy authority if need be, stand up for what is right, and challenge social norms when the situation calls for it. And that's the way they've been depicted more often than not across the history of this company. It's a special trait of Marvel, and while not certainly unique to the company, is something they have always done really well, and not something I would say they really share with DC. While that particular company is full of plenty of counterculture titles, characters, and ideas, Marvel is and has been much more consistent in this regard. Remember, many DC heroes actually are and always have been well regarded by the public in their fictional work, and usually work within the system rather than against it. This isn't a bad thing. In fact, I like that these two companies are different in this way, since it leads to two very different dynamics between the superheroes, police, and other government officials, as well as the public at large. Yet when it comes to Marvel, it's the most important aspect of those classic comics, and still something I look for in their current material. Unlike some of the other concepts in this video, counterculture is something I would say Marvel has a very unique and special history with. And if you ask me, has always been something they've been really good at, especially when compared to other major media properties. In fact, you could say when it comes to this counterculture stuff, they are the best at what they do. It's a line from Wolverine, did you get it? Hello and welcome to Comic Island. My name is Arden, and thank you for watching my top 10 Marvel concepts. So that was fun. Yeah, there was a lot of interesting choices overall in terms of what we couldn't cover on the top 10 of my favorite Marvel things, just because there's so many aspects of Marvel that are interesting. So if there's any you feel I forgot or didn't mention, feel free to talk about them in the comments section below. Otherwise, thanks a lot for watching. And if you liked this video, you can definitely thank Jeremy Renfro. It was kind of his idea, kind of natural follow-up to the DC top 10 concepts. And on the whole, I quite enjoyed making this video, so thanks Jeremy. Jeremy's one of our patrons, and you can support Comic Island similarly if you check out our Patreon page in the video description below. Finally, don't forget to like, subscribe, and keep reading comics.